at 30,000 feet above the earth. Everything was calm. Passengers were relaxed. Some were asleep. Some were watching movies. Some were thinking about home. No one knew that in less than 10 minutes, every adult in charge of that plane would become completely helpless, and the only person left to act would be a 12-year-old girl. No one had even noticed. Her name was Amani Brooks. She didn't look special. No designer clothes. No loud personality. No group of friends around her. Just a quiet girl with observant eyes and a mind that never stopped thinking. Amani sat by the window. She always chose the window. Not for the view, but for the patterns, the way the wing moved, the way the engine sounded, the rhythm of flight. To most people, flying was normal. To Amani, it was a language. Her mother, Lena, sat beside her, scrolling on her phone. "You okay?" she asked without looking up. "I'm fine," Amani replied. But she wasn't just fine. She was listening. The engine on the left wing didn't sound right. Not loud. Not broken. Just off. A tiny inconsistency. Something most people would never notice. But Amani noticed everything. Because 2 years ago, her father had taught her how. Her father, David Brooks, was a pilot. Not famous. Not rich. But brilliant. He used to say, "Planes don't fail suddenly. They whisper first. If you learn to listen, you can hear the danger before anyone else." Amani had listened. For years. After school. Late at night. While other kids watched cartoons. She studied flight systems. She didn't do it because she had to. She did it because it made sense. After her father died, it was the only thing that still did. Back in the present, Amani's eyes stayed on the wing. The vibration pattern changed again. Subtle, but real. She leaned forward slightly, counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, 47 seconds. There it was again. A tiny shift. "That's not turbulence," she whispered. She opened the small notebook she carried everywhere. Wrote, "Left engine irregular rhythm, repeating cycle." Across the aisle, a man glanced at her briefly. Then looked away. Amani didn't notice him. Not yet. The plane continued climbing. Everything seemed normal. But inside the systems, something was slowly going wrong. 30 minutes into the flight. It happened. The lights flickered. Just for a split second. Most people didn't even react. But Amani froze. That wasn't random. She looked at the ceiling panels. Then back at the wing. Then closed her eyes for a moment. Just listening. The engine pattern and the electrical flicker lined up. Her heart started beating faster. Not from fear. From realization. "This is connected," she whispered. She stood up. Walked carefully toward the front of the cabin. A flight attendant smiled politely. "Yes, sweetheart." Amani spoke calmly. "The left engine isn't stable, and the electrical system just flickered. I think there might be a system issue." The flight attendant blinked. Then smiled again. "It's okay, that happens sometimes." Amani didn't argue. But she knew. That answer was wrong. She walked back to her seat. Sat down. Looked out the window again. Then she noticed something else. A man, 3 rows behind her. He wasn't sleeping. Wasn't watching anything. Wasn't using his phone. He was watching. A panel near the back wall. And his fingers were tapping. Not casually. Nervously. Amani's eyes narrowed. She didn't stare. She never stared. But she observed. The man stood up, walked toward the back, carrying a bag. He paused near a small panel, only for a moment, then went into the restroom, came back 60 seconds later. Calm, too calm, Amani wrote. Passenger, suspicious movement, rear panel access. Her mind started connecting everything. Engine instability, electrical flicker, strange passenger behavior. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. When two things go wrong at the same time, there's always a third thing causing both. Amani's hands tightened slightly. This isn't an accident, she whispered. And then, everything changed. A loud alarm exploded through the plane. Passengers jumped. Someone screamed. The aircraft jolted. Hard. The oxygen masks dropped instantly. Chaos. People panicked. Shouting, crying, confusion. Amani didn't panic. She grabbed her mask, put it on, pulled the cord, then turned to her mother. Put yours on now. Her mother's hands were shaking, but she obeyed. The plane tilted downward. Not sharply, but steadily. A descent. Uncontrolled. Amani's eyes widened slightly. That's not commanded, she said. At the front of the cabin, the flight attendants rushed to the cockpit door. No response. They knocked. Pressed the code. Nothing. One finally forced the door open. Then froze. That silence told everyone everything. The pilots were unconscious. No one was flying the plane. The aircraft dropped again. Harder this time. People screamed. Amani stood up. Her mother grabbed her arm. Where are you going? Amani looked at her. Calm, focused, different. I need to help. And before anyone could stop her, she walked toward the cockpit, toward the place where no one expected her to go, toward the moment that would change everything. The moment Amani stepped into the cockpit, the world around her changed completely. The noise from the cabin, the screams, the panic, all of it seemed to fade into the background as her eyes locked onto the instrument panel in front of her. For most people, the cockpit would have looked like chaos, flashing warnings, loud alarms, numbers changing too fast to understand. But to Amani, it was something else entirely. It was a system speaking to her, a language she had spent years learning, even if no one had ever expected her to use it like this. The captain was slumped forward over the controls, his body weight pushing the aircraft into a dangerous downward attitude. The first officer was motionless, unresponsive, his hands no longer anywhere near the controls. The aircraft wasn't just descending. It was doing so without guidance, slowly slipping toward a situation that would soon become unrecoverable if nothing changed. The flight attendant inside the cockpit looked overwhelmed, trying to pull the captain back while glancing helplessly at the controls she didn't understand. The off-duty engineer had just entered behind Amani, scanning the panel quickly, but even he hesitated for a moment when he realized the full complexity of what was happening. Amani didn't hesitate. Her training wasn't formal. She didn't have a license. She didn't have thousands of real-world hours. But she had something else. Pattern recognition built from obsession, discipline shaped by loss, and a mind that didn't panic under pressure. In that moment, while every adult in that cockpit was overwhelmed, she did the one thing that mattered most. She focused. Her eyes moved rapidly across the instruments in a structured scan, exactly the way her father had taught her. First, the attitude indicator. The nose was down, not dramatically but dangerously enough to build speed and lose altitude steadily. Then the airspeed climbing faster than it should, the altimeter dropping, the vertical speed indicator showing a descent rate that confirmed what she already felt. Then the engine instruments, right engine stable, left engine degrading. Then the trim system, slightly off, forcing the aircraft downward even without pilot input. It took her less than 5 seconds to understand the situation. We need to get him off the controls, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the tension in the cockpit. The engineer looked at her, surprised not just by what she said but how she said it. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity. He nodded immediately, moving with the flight attendant to pull the captain's weight back from the control column. As soon as the pressure was removed, the aircraft responded slightly, the nose lifting just a fraction, but not enough to stabilize. Amani moved into the first officer's seat. For a split second, the engineer hesitated again, not because he doubted her intelligence, but because of what this moment meant. A child was about to take control of a commercial aircraft mid-emergency. But then he looked back at the instruments, at the rate of descent, at the failing systems, and he realized something critical. There was no better option. Amani secured herself into the seat quickly, her hands already finding the controls with instinctive precision. The autopilot was still engaged, but it was struggling, fighting incorrect inputs caused by the earlier imbalance and the captain's weight on the controls. It wasn't stabilizing the aircraft. It was making small corrections that weren't enough to counter the underlying problem. "I need the autopilot off," Amani said. The engineer responded immediately, disengaging it. The moment it clicked off, the aircraft's true behavior came through the controls. The nose wanted to drop. The left side wanted to dip slightly due to the engine imbalance. It wasn't violent, but it was persistent, like a force slowly pulling the plane in the wrong direction. Amani applied gentle back pressure on the controls, not too much, not too little. She didn't fight the plane, she guided it. At the same time, her other hand moved to adjust the trim, carefully rolling it to neutralize the downward bias. The aircraft responded gradually, the descent slowing, then stabilizing, then finally leveling out. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. The uncontrolled descent had stopped. Inside the cabin, passengers didn't understand what had happened, but they felt it. The falling sensation eased. The violent uncertainty softened into something more stable. The screaming didn't stop completely, but it shifted into something less desperate. Hope had entered the situation, even if no one knew why. Back in the cockpit, the engineer stared at the instruments, then at Amani. "You stabilized it?" he said quietly, almost in disbelief. "Temporarily," she replied without looking away. "The left engine is still failing." Her focus shifted immediately to the next problem. Stabilizing the aircraft was only the first step. Keeping it in the air and getting it safely to the ground would require far more. The left engine's performance was dropping slowly but consistently. Not a sudden failure, which would have been easier to identify, but a gradual degradation, something that suggested a deeper issue. At the same time, the fuel system was behaving unevenly, creating an imbalance that could worsen the aircraft's stability if not managed carefully. Amani's mind moved quickly, analyzing possibilities. Mechanical failure? Possible. But combined with the earlier electrical flicker and the strange passenger behavior she had observed, it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. "Open the fuel crossfeed," she said. The engineer followed her instruction immediately. As the fuel flow balanced between the tanks, the left engine's decline slowed. Not fixed, but stabilized enough to buy time. Time was everything now. The radio crackled to life, and the engineer quickly handed it to Amani. She took it without hesitation, pressing the transmit button. "This is an emergency. Both pilots are unresponsive. Aircraft is under limited control. Request immediate assistance." There was a brief pause. Then a voice came through, sharp and alert. "Aircraft, identify yourself. Who is flying?" Amani didn't hesitate. "My name is Amani Brooks. I am in the right seat. I have control of the aircraft." There was a silence on the other end, not disbelief but recalculation. The controller wasn't concerned with her age. He was concerned with whether she could maintain control. "Are you stable?" he asked. "For now," she replied, "but I have a degrading engine and possible system interference." The engineer glanced at her again, this time not with doubt, but with something closer to respect. Because she wasn't just reacting. She was thinking ahead. As the aircraft continued forward through the sky, Amani adjusted the heading slightly, keeping it stable despite the imbalance. Her arms were beginning to feel the strain now. Real aircraft controls were heavier than anything she had trained on, and the feedback was constant. Every correction required effort. Every second demanded focus. But she didn't show it. Because she couldn't afford to. Behind her, 200 lives depended on what she did next. And deep down, beneath the pressure, beneath the fear she refused to acknowledge. One thought stayed with her. This wasn't just an emergency. This meant something. The patterns, the timing, the passenger. The way everything had unfolded. It wasn't random. And if she was right, then someone on that plane had caused this. As the aircraft pushed forward through unstable air, Amani's focus never left the instruments, but her mind was working on two levels at once. One part of her was flying the plane, managing altitude, adjusting thrust, correcting subtle drifts in direction. The other part was reconstructing everything that had happened since before takeoff. Every detail she had noticed, every small inconsistency, every instinct she had trusted, all of it now began to align into something far more serious than a mechanical failure. The engineer, whose name she had finally heard as Mr. Warren, was still scanning the overhead panels, checking switches, circuit breakers, and system responses. His movements were efficient, practiced, but there was tension in them now. Not panic, but urgency. He understood what Amani was beginning to understand, that this situation was too structured, too layered to be accidental. Aircraft systems did fail, but they did not usually fail in patterns that synchronized across electrical, propulsion, and control systems in such a precise way. "Amani," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so it didn't interfere with her concentration, "there are two circuit breakers here that don't look right. They're not tripped normally. They've been pulled deliberately." That confirmed it. Amani didn't react outwardly, but inside everything locked into place. The engine instability, the electrical flicker, the trim imbalance. These were not random faults. They were engineered disruptions, small enough individually to avoid immediate detection, but together powerful enough to destabilize the aircraft over time. "Someone did this," she said, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't a guess anymore. It was a conclusion. Mr. Warren looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think you're right." For a brief second, the weight of that realization passed between them. This wasn't just about flying anymore. This was about intent, about someone on board who had made a decision to interfere with a machine carrying hundreds of lives. Amani's grip on the controls tightened slightly as she adjusted for a minor roll to the left. The aircraft responded, steady but still not entirely stable. The left engine continued to operate below optimal performance, and every correction she made required effort. She could feel it building in her arms, the physical strain increasing as time passed. But she pushed it aside, because now there was something else to consider. "Mr. Warren," she said, still watching the instruments, "the passenger I saw earlier, the one who went to the rear panel, he had a bag with him. He was nervous before he went back there, but calm when he returned." Warren's expression changed immediately. "You're sure?" "Yes," she replied, "and he was watching the same panel before that." Warren exhaled slowly. That rear panel gives access to part of the avionics cooling system and some wiring channels. If someone knew what they were doing, they could introduce faults without triggering immediate alarms. Amani processed that quickly. So this wasn't random sabotage, it was controlled. Exactly. The implication was chilling. Whoever had done this didn't want the plane to fail instantly. They wanted it to fail gradually. Quietly. Unpredictably. Amani's thoughts shifted again, this time toward something more personal, something she had tried not to think about since the flight began. Her father. The meeting in Denver. The unexplained hesitation in her mother's voice when she mentioned it. The idea formed slowly, but once it did, it wouldn't go away. What if this flight wasn't chosen randomly? What if it was chosen because of who was on it? Her heart rate increased slightly, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She couldn't afford distraction, not now. The radio crackled again, breaking through her thoughts. The controller's voice returned, more stable now, guiding her with calm precision. He provided headings, altitude adjustments, and distance updates to the nearest airport capable of handling an emergency landing. "Amani, you're doing well," he said. "We're preparing the runway. Emergency crews are in position. I need you to begin a gradual descent." She acknowledged the instruction and adjusted the aircraft accordingly. The descent had to be controlled, too fast, and she risked losing stability, too slow, and the failing engine might not hold out long enough. As the aircraft began its descent, the weather ahead changed. Dark clouds, unstable air, the kind of storm that wasn't supposed to be there. Turbulence hit the aircraft in uneven waves, pushing it slightly off course. Amani corrected each movement carefully, her attention divided between maintaining control and monitoring the engine's performance. "Left engine is dropping again," Warren said. Amani nodded. She had already seen it. "Reduce load on it," she said. "Shift more thrust to the right engine. That'll increase yaw." "I know." She adjusted the rudder accordingly, counteracting the imbalance. The aircraft responded, not perfectly, but enough to maintain control. Every decision now was a trade-off. Every adjustment came with a consequence. And she had to balance them all. In the cabin, the situation had changed as well. The panic had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more focused. Passengers were watching, waiting, holding on to whatever sense of stability they could find. Amani's mother had moved through the aisle, speaking to people, reassuring them, trying to keep the situation from collapsing into chaos again. And at the back of the plane, the man sat quietly. Too quietly. Gerald, one of the flight attendants, kept a close watch on him just as Amani had instructed. The man didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't react. He just sat there, waiting. Back in the cockpit, Amani's thoughts returned to him briefly. Not with fear, but with certainty. Whatever he had done, he believed it would work. He believed the plane would fail before anyone could stop it. But he hadn't accounted for one thing. He hadn't accounted for her. The aircraft descended further, breaking through layers of cloud as the ground slowly came closer into view. The runway was still miles away, but it was now a real destination, not just an idea. Amani adjusted the speed, managing the delicate balance between maintaining lift and conserving what remained of the failing engine's performance. Her arms ached now, the constant pressure and corrections taking their toll, but she didn't let it show. Because this was the final phase, the most critical part. And she knew. There was no second chance. By the time the aircraft broke through the final layer of clouds, the world below no longer looked distant or abstract. The ground was real now, solid, close, and approaching faster than anyone on board would have been comfortable with under normal circumstances. For Amani, however, this was the moment everything had been leading toward. Every correction she had made, every decision she had balanced, every second she had held the aircraft together, it all pointed here. This was no longer about stabilizing the situation. This was about finishing it. Her eyes remained locked on the runway ahead, visible now in the distance, a narrow strip of concrete surrounded by flashing emergency lights. Fire trucks, ambulances, and ground crews were already positioned, waiting. The controller's voice continued in her ear, steady and precise, guiding her through the final approach path, but by now Amani needed less instruction. She had already built the landing sequence in her mind, step by step, anticipating what the aircraft would do and how she would respond. The left engine was still running, but barely holding. Its output had dropped to a level where it could no longer be trusted for sustained power. The imbalance between the two engines had forced her to continuously compensate using the rudder and careful thrust management. At the same time, the trim fault had not fully resolved, meaning the aircraft still had a tendency to push downward if she relaxed her control even slightly. This wasn't a situation where she could simply line up and glide in. She had to actively fly every second of the descent. "Amani, you're cleared to land," the controller said. His voice carried a subtle weight now, not just professional responsibility, but personal investment. He had been with her through every step of the crisis, and he knew what this moment meant. "Copy that," she replied calmly. Inside the cockpit, Warren monitored the remaining systems, calling out numbers when needed, but he had stepped back just enough to give her full control. He understood that too many inputs would only complicate things. This was her aircraft now, her decisions, her responsibility. As the plane aligned with the runway, the turbulence eased slightly, but the crosswind remained. It wasn't severe, but in this condition, with one engine compromised and control systems not fully reliable, even a moderate crosswind added complexity. Amani adjusted for it instinctively, angling the aircraft just enough to maintain alignment without overcorrecting. Her breathing remained steady, but inside something deeper was happening. The pressure of the moment was immense, hundreds of lives behind her, the knowledge of sabotage, the memory of her father, but none of it overwhelmed her. Instead, it sharpened her focus. It narrowed her world down to what mattered most: the aircraft, the runway, and the decisions she needed to make in the next 60 seconds. "Speed is slightly high," Warren said. "I see it," she replied, adjusting the thrust carefully, making sure not to stress the failing engine further. The aircraft responded, gradually reducing speed without losing stability. At 500 feet above the ground, the margin for error became almost non-existent. Every movement of the controls mattered. Every second counted. In the cabin, passengers had fallen into a tense silence. The chaos from earlier had transformed into something else entirely, a shared awareness that they were moments away from either safety or disaster. Amani's mother sat gripping the armrest, her eyes closed, not in fear but in trust. She didn't understand everything her daughter was doing, but she understood one thing clearly. Amani was still in control. Back in the cockpit, Amani adjusted the descent rate slightly, aligning the aircraft perfectly with the runway centerline. The ground rushed closer, the details becoming sharper, markings on the runway, the shimmer of heat from the surface, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. 200 feet, Warren said quietly. Amani didn't respond. She was fully immersed now, her hands steady, her mind calculating continuously. At 100 feet, she began the flare, gently raising the nose of the aircraft to reduce the descent rate just before touchdown. It had to be precise. Too early and the aircraft would stall slightly before landing. Too late and the impact would be too hard. The aircraft responded slowly, heavily, but correctly. The wheels touched the runway. Not perfectly smooth, but controlled. Safe. For a split second there was silence, almost disbelief. Then the reality hit. They were on the ground. Amani immediately deployed the brakes, managing the deceleration carefully to maintain directional control. With one engine underperforming, the aircraft had a slight tendency to drift, but she corrected it smoothly, keeping the plane aligned until it slowed to a safe speed. Finally, the aircraft came to a complete stop. And for the first time since the emergency began, everything was still. Inside the cabin, the silence broke into something overwhelming: relief, disbelief, emotion all at once. People cried, laughed, held onto each other. Some simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. In the cockpit, Warren let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked at Amani, not as a child, not as a passenger, but as someone who had just done something extraordinary. "You landed it," he said. Amani didn't respond immediately. She was still looking at the runway ahead, her hands resting lightly on the controls. Slowly, she exhaled, the tension in her body finally beginning to release. "Yeah," she said quietly, "we made it." But the story wasn't over. Within minutes, emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. Medical teams rushed on board, attending to the pilots first, then checking passengers. Security personnel moved quickly as well, heading straight toward the rear of the cabin. The man, he didn't resist. As officers approached him, he simply sat there, his expression unreadable. When they stood him up and placed him in restraints, he didn't argue, didn't speak, didn't react. But as he was escorted down the aisle, his eyes briefly met Amani's. And in that moment, she understood something. He hadn't expected her. Later, as investigators began piecing everything together, the truth emerged. The sabotage had been carefully planned, designed to create a cascading failure that would appear mechanical at first, then become catastrophic mid-flight. The timing, the systems targeted, the subtlety, it all pointed to someone with deep technical knowledge. But the most shocking part wasn't how it was done. It was why. The flight hadn't been random. It had been chosen. Because of a name on the passenger list. Amani Brooks. And her father. David Brooks had not just been a pilot. He had been involved in exposing serious safety violations within a private aviation contractor, violations that someone had wanted buried. His death, which had been ruled an accident, was now being reopened as part of a larger investigation. This flight was never meant to land safely. But it did, because of the one variable no one had accounted for. A quiet 12-year-old girl who listened. In the days that followed, the story spread everywhere. News channels, social media, interviews, everyone wanted to understand how something like this had happened. But Amani didn't seek attention. She didn't speak dramatically about what she had done. When asked how she managed to stay calm, she gave the simplest answer possible. I just did what made sense. To the world, it sounded humble. But to those who truly understood, it meant everything. Because what she had done wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was preparation, discipline, and the ability to stay clear when everything else was falling apart. And somewhere, in a way no one could fully explain, it was also the continuation of her father's legacy. Not just in what he had taught her, but in what she had chosen to become.